The Appalachian Mountains have always kept secrets. They hold them in the deep hollows, in the coal-black soil, in the bones of the people who came searching for a better life and found only hardship. Some secrets are buried deliberately, hidden beneath the roots of ancient hemlocks or in the foundations of cabins long since reclaimed by the forest. Others wait to be discovered, unearthed by accident or by the stubborn persistence of those who refuse to let the dead rest. This is the story of one such discovery. It began in the autumn of 1929, just weeks before the stock market crash that would devastate the nation, though the people of Corbin Holler had little to lose that the mountains hadn't already taken from them. A surveyor named Emmett Hargrave was working for the Kentucky Highway Department, plotting a route for a new road that would connect the isolated communities of Letcher County to the wider world. The work was slow, treacherous. The mountains were steep, the hollows deep, and the old-growth timber made sightlines nearly impossible. Hargrave had been at it for 3 weeks when he came across something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The holler was a dead end, choked with rhododendron thickets and the remains of a cabin that had collapsed decades earlier. The stone chimney still stood, a blackened finger pointing toward the gray sky. Hargrave pushed through the brush, looking for a place to set his transit, and that's when he saw the ground had settled unevenly in one spot, as if something beneath it had rotted and collapsed. The sinkhole was small, maybe 4 feet across, but when he kicked at the loose soil, he uncovered something that made him step back sharply. A human skull. Yellowed with age. Cracked at the temple. The teeth were still intact, frozen in a grimace that might have been pain or might have been fear. Hargrave should have gone straight to the sheriff. That was what any reasonable man would have done. But he was a curious man, a man who had spent his life reading the landscape like a book, and he couldn't resist the urge to see what else lay beneath the surface. He knelt down and began to dig with his hands, the cold mountain earth caking beneath his fingernails. As he cleared away the soil, he found more bones, arranged in a haphazard jumble. And then he found a second skull, smaller, more delicate. A child's. The discovery should have been enough. 2 skeletons in an unmarked grave, hidden for who knows how long in a forgotten corner of the mountains. But it was what Hargrave found next that turned a grim discovery into a genuine mystery. Beneath the child's ribs, nestled as if placed there deliberately, was a leather-bound journal. The binding was cracked and dry, the pages stiff with age, but when he opened it, Hargrave could see the ink was still readable, a neat, feminine hand that had recorded the final days of someone's life in careful, deliberate prose. The first entry was dated October 12, 1886. And the last entry, dated October 31st of the same year, ended in mid-sentence. The journal was the only reason anyone ever learned the name of the woman buried in that shallow grave. But it raised far more questions than it answered. Who had killed her? Who had killed her child? Why had the grave been so hastily dug and so carefully hidden? And why had the journal been left behind, a witness to a crime that no one had ever been punished for? The story of Cordelia Lunsford begins, as so many Appalachian stories do, with the Civil War. Not the war itself, but its aftermath. The mountains were a crucible of violence long after Appomattox, a place where old scores were settled with gunpowder and steel. The war had divided families, pitted neighbor against neighbor, and left a legacy of bitterness that would persist for generations. Cordelia's father, Jeremiah Lunsford, had been a Union man in a part of Kentucky that was deeply and violently Confederate. He had served in the 9th Kentucky Infantry, had fought at Perryville and Chickamauga, and had come home with a limp and a hollow look in his eyes that never quite went away. The Lunsfords were yeoman farmers, scratching a living out of the thin mountain soil. They had a small cabin, a few acres of cleared land, and a stubborn determination to survive. Jeremiah had married late, after the war, to a woman named Ruth who bore him 4 children, only 2 of whom lived past infancy. Cordelia was the eldest, born in 1870, and she had inherited her mother's dark hair and quiet demeanor. She was intelligent, literate, and restless, a dangerous combination in a world where women were expected to be obedient and uncomplaining. The journal that Hargrave found provides an intimate portrait of Cordelia's life in the years before her death. She wrote about the daily rhythms of mountain existence, the planting and harvesting, the canning and preserving, the endless cycle of work that kept body and soul together. She wrote about her mother's slow decline, the consumption that racked her lungs and left her a ghost of her former self. And she wrote about her father's growing obsession with something he had found in the mountains, something he refused to discuss with anyone but his trusted circle of veterans. "There is a secret in these hills that I am not meant to know," Cordelia wrote in January 1886. "Father speaks of it only in whispers, and only when John Hardesty visits. They believe I am asleep, but I have heard enough to understand that there is something hidden, something that men have died for. I do not know what it is, and I am afraid to ask. But I am also afraid not to know." The journal entries from that winter grow increasingly troubled. Cordelia describes arguments between her father and Hardesty, arguments that escalated from harsh words to physical threats. She writes of strangers passing through the holler at night, men who came and went without leaving names or explanation. And she writes of her own growing fear, a conviction that something terrible was about to happen. "This morning I found a bullet hole in the window," she wrote in March. "Father said it was a stray shot from a hunter, but I know better. There were no hunters. The deer have all fled this place, as if they know something we do not. I watched from the window as Father and John buried something in the woods. I did not see what it was, but I saw them carrying a heavy box between them. When I asked, Father told me to mind my own business. His eyes were cold in a way I have never seen before. I am afraid. I am so afraid. What was in that box? Cordelia doesn't say, and perhaps she never knew. But the timing of these events coincides with something far larger than a family dispute. In the years following the Civil War, the Appalachian Mountains had become a battleground of a different sort. The timber companies were moving in, buying up land rights for pennies, stripping the old-growth forests that had stood for centuries. The coal companies were not far behind, acquiring mineral rights through fraud and intimidation, evicting families who had lived on the land for generations. And then there were the railroads, their surveyors laying out routes that would cut through the mountains like a knife, connecting the isolated hollows to the commercial centers of the East. Jeremiah Lunsford and John Hardesty had been soldiers together, had fought side by side in the bloody carnage of the Western Theater. And like many veterans, they had come home to find that the world they had fought for no longer existed. The promise of Reconstruction had faltered, the homesteads promised to the poor had vanished into the hands of speculators, and the bonds of community had been shattered by 4 years of brutal war. But they had returned with something else, something that would shape the course of their lives and ultimately lead to tragedy. They had returned with knowledge. During the war, the Union Army had established a network of supply routes through the mountains, secret paths that allowed them to move men and material without Confederate interference. These routes had been mapped by scouts and civilians, men who knew the terrain intimately and were willing to risk their lives to see the Union prevail. After the war, these maps had fallen into the hands of speculators and entrepreneurs, men who saw in the mountains not the blood-soaked soil of a battlefield but the potential for immense profit. The timber was worth a fortune, the coal was worth even more, and the railroads would need both to fuel the engines of industry. Jeremiah Lunsford had served as a guide on one of these supply routes, leading pack trains through the mountains to resupply Union garrisons in the region. He had seen the timber, the coal, the iron ore that lay beneath the surface, and he had understood its value. But he had also seen something else, something that had nothing to do with the war and everything to do with the land itself. During one of his expeditions, he had discovered a cave system that ran deep beneath the mountains, a network of tunnels that the local Native American tribes had known about for centuries. And in those tunnels, he had found evidence of something that had been hidden for generations. What was it? The journal doesn't say. But there are hints, tantalizing clues scattered throughout Cordelia's increasingly frantic entries. She mentions the old metal that her father had found, objects that were clearly not of Native American origin. She writes of symbols carved into the cave walls, symbols that no one could interpret. And she describes a map, old and worn, that her father kept hidden in a lockbox beneath his bed. It is not gold, she wrote in April. I have seen the things he has brought back, and they are not precious in the way that men think of precious. They are old. Older than anything I have ever seen. Some are made of copper, others of a metal I cannot identify. There are objects that might be tools, and others that might be weapons. But they are not from here. I am certain of that. They come from somewhere else, from a time before the Indians, before anyone. Father believes they are the remains of a civilization that existed before the flood. I do not know what to believe, but I know that these things have brought a curse upon this house. The men who come in the night are not looking for land or timber or coal. They are looking for what lies beneath the ground. And they are willing to kill to find it. This is the point in the story where the historical record becomes murky, a tangle of half-truths, legends, and deliberate omissions. There are records of a group calling themselves the Knights of the Golden Circle operating in the region during this period, a shadowy organization that had evolved from its pre-war roots as a pro-slavery conspiracy into something darker and more mysterious. The Knights were rumored to be searching for artifacts from a lost civilization, objects that they believed would give them power over their enemies. They were also rumored to be involved in the illicit antiquities trade, smuggling artifacts out of the mountains and selling them to wealthy collectors in the East. But there is no definitive proof that the Knights of the Golden Circle had anything to do with the deaths in Corbin Holler. The records of the organization were almost entirely destroyed in the years following the Civil War, and what little remains is fragmented and contradictory. Some historians believe the organization disbanded entirely, while others argue that it simply went underground, evolving into secret societies that persist to this day. The truth, like so much else in this story, is buried in the same soil that held Cordelia's bones. The journal entries for the spring and summer of 1886 grow increasingly dark. Cordelia writes of her father's paranoia, his conviction that spies were watching their every move. She writes of John Hardisty's disappearance, a sudden absence that left her father in a state of near catatonic depression. And she writes of her own deepening isolation, the feeling that the world was closing in around her. John is dead, she wrote in July. I do not know how I know this, but I am certain of it. Father will not speak of it, but I see it in his eyes. John knew too much, and they killed him for it. Now I fear they will come for us. Father has begun to dig a grave in the woods. He will not tell me why. He will not tell me anything. He just digs and digs, and I watch from the window and wonder if I will be the next one he buries. The next entry is dated 3 days later, and it reads only, I have found it. I have found what they are looking for. And now I understand why they are willing to kill for it. What did she find? The journal doesn't say. But there is a key, a small brass key that was found among Cordelia's bones, a key that Hargrave didn't notice until later, when he had cleaned the skeleton for examination. The key had been hidden in her ribcage, perhaps swallowed or concealed in her clothing, and it had survived the decades of decay. The key is remarkably ornate, its handle shaped like a cross with a crescent moon at its center, an iconography that is not at all Christian and not easily identifiable with any known religious tradition. The key is now in the possession of the Letcher County Historical Society, where it has been examined by several historians and archaeologists. None of them have been able to identify its origin or purpose. It is clearly old, far older than the 19th century, and its craftsmanship is sophisticated in a way that suggests a culture with advanced metalworking techniques. But what civilization produced it? The inscriptions that cover the key are in a language that has never been deciphered, an alphabet that bears no resemblance to any known writing system. The question of the key has haunted researchers for nearly a century. What did it open? A door? A lockbox? A cave? The answer may lie in the story of Mary and Russell Langley, the final witnesses to the tragedy in Corbin Holler. The Langleys were the only other family in the immediate vicinity of the holler, a small homestead about a mile up the mountain. Mary was a midwife, one of those unofficial healers who brought babies into the world and guided the dying out of it. Russell was a farmer, a quiet man who kept to himself and avoided the quarrels that had become so common in the region. They had 6 children, all of whom survived to adulthood, a remarkable feat in an era when infant mortality was the norm. By the time the Langleys became involved in the story, events were already in motion. Cordelia's mother had died in August, her consumption having claimed her at last. Ruth's final days were filled with pain and delirium, and she repeatedly called out for someone named Ezekiel, a name that meant nothing to anyone in the family. But in her final moments, she pulled Cordelia close and whispered something in her ear. She said, "I must find Ezekiel," Cordelia wrote in August. She said, "He is the only one who knows the truth. But Ezekiel is dead, I think." She was delirious. She did not know what she was saying. But I cannot shake the feeling that she was trying to tell me something important. The name means nothing to me, but I have heard it before. In Father's voice. In the voices of the men who come in the night. I do not know what to do. I do not know where to go. It was Mary Langley who found them. The bodies, the journal, the evidence of a crime that no one had ever been punished for. But there is something strange about Mary's own account of what she saw, an inconsistency that has troubled researchers for years. In the official record, Mary claims that she stumbled upon the grave while searching for herbs in the woods. But in a letter she wrote to her sister in Virginia, which surfaced in 2005, she tells a different story. "I knew where the bodies were buried," she wrote. "I had known from the moment I found the baby's dress in the well. That little white dress with the pink embroidery. Cordelia had sewn it herself, had worked on it for weeks, a labor of love that was meant to be a gift for the child she was carrying. But the child was not her husband's. That was the secret that destroyed everything. And the father of that child was someone who would not let her live to tell the world." This letter, which was acquired by the Historical Society in 2016, adds a new dimension to the mystery. Cordelia was pregnant? The journal doesn't mention it, and the skeleton that was found in the grave shows no evidence of pregnancy. But Mary's account is compelling, and it fits with what we know about the social dynamics of the region. An unmarried woman with child in 1886 Appalachia would have been an outcast, shunned by her community and likely abandoned by her family. But the father of the child, whoever he was, would have had his own reasons for silencing her. The baby's dress that Mary found in the well still exists, preserved in a glass case at the Historical Society. It is a heartbreakingly small thing, a simple white dress with delicate pink embroidery around the collar. The workmanship is exquisite, a testament to Cordelia's skill and the love she poured into a garment that would never be worn. The dress is carefully folded, as if placed deliberately in the well, and it bears no signs of having been in water. This suggests that the dress was not simply discarded, it was hidden. Someone wanted it found, but only by the right person. The Mary Langley letter also provides a possible explanation for why the murders were never investigated thoroughly. She writes that the sheriff was a friend of the family, and that he was more interested in protecting the reputations of the living than in seeking justice for the dead. She also implies that there was a cover-up, that powerful men were involved in the case and that they used their influence to ensure that the truth never came to light. Jeremiah Lunsford was not the only one who knew about the cave, she wrote. There were others, men from the city, men with money and power. They came to the mountains looking for something, and they found it. But Cordelia found it too. And she was not afraid to speak of it. That is why she had to die. And that is why her child had to die. The secret could not be allowed to live. This is the conspiracy, the dark undercurrent that runs through the entire story. But what was the secret? Mary's letter doesn't provide an answer, but there is another document, a fragment found in the same well where the baby's dress was discovered. It is a single page of paper, yellowed and brittle, with what appears to be a drawing on one side and a few lines of text on the other. The drawing is a map, crude but identifiable, showing a river and the outline of a mountain with a cross marked at its base. The text is in the same hand as Cordelia's journal, and it reads, "Here lies the past. Here lies the future. Here lies the truth that cannot be spoken." The map has been compared to survey records from the period, but no exact match has been found. The river could be the North Fork of the Kentucky River, which runs through Letcher County, but the geography of the map is too vague to pinpoint an exact location. The cross marked at the base of the mountain is also ambiguous. It could represent a grave, a cave, or a surveying marker. What is clear is that someone believed the map was important enough to hide, and that they were willing to kill to keep it secret. The story of Cordelia Lunsford has all the elements of a Gothic tragedy: a young woman trapped in a violent family, a hidden treasure, a secret society, and a violent death that remains unsolved. But there is another layer to the mystery, a final twist that changes everything we thought we knew about the case. The key and the confession. In 1998, an anonymous donor sent a letter to the Letcher County Historical Society along with a small wooden box. The letter was typed, with no return address, and it contained a simple message: "This belongs with the other artifacts. I found it in my grandfather's effects after he died, and I cannot live with what it represents any longer." The box contained a small brass key, nearly identical to the one found with Cordelia's bones. But this key bore different markings, a star and a crescent moon entwined, and the metal was tarnished with age. The key was accompanied by a set of handwritten documents, pages of faded ink that were clearly old, possibly from the 19th century. The documents were written in the same hand as Cordelia's journal. "This is the truth that I have kept hidden for too long," Cordelia wrote. "My father's sin is my sin, and I cannot escape it. He killed John Hardesty because John discovered the secret he was trying to keep. He killed my mother because she was too ill to keep the secret any longer. And now he will kill me. I am the last witness. When I am gone, the secret will be safe. But I cannot let that happen. I have written this confession in the hope that someone will find it and know the truth." The confession goes on to describe what happened in the summer of 1886. Jeremiah Lunsford, Cordelia's father, had been involved in a conspiracy to sell stolen artifacts to a collector in the East. The artifacts had been looted from a cave that Jeremiah had discovered during the war, a cave that contained the remains of a civilization that had existed long before the first Europeans arrived in the Americas. The artifacts were valuable, but they were also dangerous. They were believed to hold power that the Knights of the Golden Circle had been searching for decades. John Hardesty had been Jeremiah's partner in the venture, but he had become a liability when he threatened to reveal the location of the cave to a rival collector. Jeremiah had killed Hardesty and disposed of his body in the mine shaft. Ruth, Cordelia's mother, had witnessed the murder, and Jeremiah had poisoned her slowly, a dose of arsenic in her tea every day until her body gave out. Cordelia had discovered the truth, and she had confronted her father. The argument had been violent, and Jeremiah had struck her, fracturing her skull. He had buried her in a shallow grave in the woods, and he had placed her journal in the grave beside her, a final act of contempt. But the confession also contains something unexpected, a revelation that has never been fully explained. Cordelia writes that there was a child, a daughter, who had been hidden away after the murders. The child, she writes, was the rightful heir to something that her father had found in the cave. What that something was, she does not say. But she writes that the child was taken by a woman known only as the keeper, a woman who had been entrusted with the secret of the cave and its treasures. The identity of the keeper has never been established. She appears nowhere else in the historical record, and her name is not mentioned in any of the documents associated with the case. But the possibility of a lost child, a descendant who might still be alive, has fascinated researchers for years. If the keeper was real, she would have been responsible for protecting a legacy that stretched back centuries. And that legacy, whatever it was, would have been the true motive for the crimes committed in Corbin Holler. The final twist in this story is that the location of the cave still hasn't been found. The map hidden in the well is fragmentary, and the terrain of the mountains has changed significantly since 1886. Strip mining and logging have altered the landscape, and many of the old landmarks described in the journal have been destroyed. But the search continues, as it has for decades, driven by a belief that the truth is still waiting to be uncovered. A haunting question. And so we return to the key, the object that has haunted this story from the beginning. What does it open? The caves, perhaps. Or maybe something else, a lockbox or a chest that still holds the artifacts Jeremiah Lunsford stole. The key was found with Cordelia's remains, hidden in her ribcage. But it is not the only key. 2 keys, made to fit the same lock, with the same enigmatic symbols and the same sense of ancient power. Who made the keys? And what did they guard? The mountains do not speak. The story of Cordelia Lunsford is a story of secrets. It is a story of greed and violence, of family betrayal and impossible love. But it is also a story of resilience, the story of a woman who faced unimaginable horror and still found the courage to leave a record of what she had witnessed. Without her journal, we would know nothing about the tragedy that unfolded in Corbin Holler. Her bones would still be lying in that shallow grave, her secrets buried with her. But she did leave a record. She wrote her truth, and she placed her journal where someone would eventually find it. That act of defiance, that refusal to remain silent, is her true legacy. In a world where women were not allowed to speak, where their voices were silenced by law and custom, Cordelia Lunsford found a way to make herself heard. The journal, the keys, the baby's dress, the map, all of these artifacts speak of a woman who refused to be forgotten. They are fragments of a life that was cut short, pieces of a puzzle that we may never fully solve. The cave, if it exists, has never been found. The artifacts it contains, if any ever existed, have disappeared into the murky channels of the antiquities trade. The descendants of the keeper, if there are any, have never come forward. The truth of what happened in Corbin Holler is a ghost, a specter that haunts the mountains and will not rest. But perhaps that is the point. Some secrets are never meant to be uncovered. Some truths are too terrible to be spoken aloud. And some stories exist only to remind us that the past is never truly past. It lives in the land, in the stones, in the whispers of the wind through the pines. It lives in the bones that lie beneath the soil, waiting for someone to dig them up and ask the question that has never been answered. What did Cordelia find in that cave? What was worth killing for? What did the keeper guard? And what happened to the child, the daughter who was hidden away, the last remnant of a legacy that has been lost to the ages? We will never know. The mountains will never tell. And the key, that small brass key that has baffled historians for a century, remains a silent witness to a crime that has never been solved. But in the end, that is the nature of history. It is a story we tell ourselves to make sense of a world that rarely makes sense. It is a collection of fragments, a mosaic of broken pieces that we can never quite complete. And it is the unanswered questions, the mysteries that refuse to be solved, that keep us searching for the truth. Cordelia Lunsford died in 1886, murdered by someone she trusted, buried in a grave that was never marked. But her voice has survived, her words preserved in ink on yellowed paper. She speaks to us from across the decades, a whisper that refuses to be silenced. And she asks us the same question she asked herself in the final moments of her life. What is the truth that cannot be spoken?